guest speaker in the Grieving and Bereavement panel, Sophie Kromholz, who's going to give us a talk called "And Then There Was Nothing Left: Creative Strategies to Contemplate the Carnality of Absence." So over to you, Sophie. Thanks, everyone.
All right. I'm going to share my screen. So I will not be seeing as I share my screen if there are any comments, but gosh, if anything pops up and feels really urgent, you can unmute yourself and make yourself known.
I'll do that. I'll do that for you too.
Great. So can you all see my screen?
Yep, all good.
Perfect. Then there we'll go. Hello everyone from Grey Glasgow. I hope some of you are getting some light breaking through. I would like to open with a Louise Erdrich quote. "Life will break you. Nobody can protect you from that, and being alone won't either. For solitude will also break you with its yearning. You have to love, and you have to feel. It is the reason you are here on earth. You have to risk your heart. You are here to be swallowed up. And when it happens that you are broken, or betrayed, or left or hurt, or death rushes too near, let yourself sit by an apple tree and listen to the apples falling all around you in heaps, wasting their sweetness. Tell yourself that you tasted as many as you could." So I have always been attracted to artworks that feel like swan songs, works that challenge with their fragility, those physical pieces that make palpable something for which words often feel a little too rigid, that through their visual eloquence make it hard to turn away from difficult and painful truths, that ask us to be human and present, and that break us open like a cracked fruit. At the core of it, I suppose I'm interested in learning to hold space for sadness and challenging conversations. I think as a society that we have so many band-aids that are attempts to get us to glance over hardship and disengage. And this creates a kind of congealed trauma that permeates through everything that we do and all the relationships that we form. And that's where art comes in, to help give shape to the unutterable. Bruce Nussbaum has stated that creative people know how to navigate uncertainties and articulate futures. And in this pocket of time that we have carved out together, we'll look at some artworks that serve as creative strategies in discussing death and inevitability. I will be talking about Felix Gonzalez Torres's Candy Spills and Moto Yamamoto's Saltscapes. Both series are temporary material manifestations of what Utako Shindo would refer to as the untranslatable, where art gives form to what words cannot. A lot of my career as a creative researcher and an art historian has been a sort of love story looking at works that necessitate material change. And with this, perform what I would argue is a kind of transformative pedagogical exploration of experience. I like things that are difficult, precarious. The constraints tell us something about the living things in flight. As we all know, the art world and market find ways to contain even the most ephemeral pieces. This is the inevitability of capitalism and patriarchy, which demand ownership and find ways to lock things in place. The precarity for survival demands unconventional strategies in contemplating longevity. This negotiation, it's a kind of dance which frames the essence of where the artwork draws its boundaries, the responsibilities of care, and indeed exactly what it is that keeps an artwork alive. That's where the magic happens. These tensions and necessary discussions are where the spark is, illuminating at least some of the shadows in the dark. Felix Gonzalez Torres the first artist I'd like to look at was born in Cuba in 1957. He grew up in Puerto Rico and moved to the US as a young man, becoming an American citizen in 1976. Although González Torres trained as a photographer, he began to immerse himself in contemporary critical theory in the 1980s, also becoming a member of artist group Material. And during this time, González Torres made a move towards conceptual art and began making these minimalist works for which he's best known. The works that I'd like to focus on are some of his most iconic pieces, namely the candy spills that stem from the 1990s, for which he gained international recognition. In a time when other artists like Andy Warhol were experimenting with notions of endlessness and immortality by using techniques which could be reproduced ceaselessly, González Torres' work was preoccupied with the exact opposite, the temporary. Nothing is forever, his work says. Material perishes, and so do we. The famous candy spills were produced during the 1990s over a period of roughly 3 years. The titling of the artist's spills always takes the same distinct form, namely the initial word untitled, a wink at minimalism, paired with a subtitle in parentheses. The pieces without context or clarification of their narrative can feel trite. A big pile of candy dumped on a floor in a gallery space. The portraits require a second look and an explanation in order to break your heart. So here I would like to hone in on Untitled, Portrait of Ross in LA, 1991. Composed of candies wrapped in multicolored cellophane. This is the piece that always shatters me the most and really kind of comes to the crux of what the candy spills encapsulate and play with. Ross Laycock was González Torres' partner who contracted HIV. And when Laycock was diagnosed, the attending physician set his ideal weight at 175 pounds. Untitled, Portrait of Ross in LA is just that. It is a pile of candy starting out as an initial heap of 175 pounds. Upon display, the audience is invited to take a piece of candy with them, prompting the complicit unraveling of Ross's body. Inevitably, as the audience begins to engage with the work, pieces of candy begin to disappear in the audience's mouths or pockets. The spills change shape. Their original form and weight is upset. The work becomes smaller and smaller, more fragile, a shadow of its former impressive weight, until there's nothing left. All of the spills serve as eulogies, sugary swan songs, to whomever or whatever is referenced in their parentheses. The candy spills comment on space, not only because they are built up of a particular volume that changes, but also because of their installation, which plays with the role of the audience. The spills consist of many individual whole pieces of candy, but the singular pieces make no sense by themselves. It is only as they are piled together to form the work, the portrait, and once the audience begins to interact, that the spill develops a rounded narrative. The spills entice visitors to actively participate and reflect on their actions and their relationship to the work, to Ross. The active dynamic at play in these works is crucial and really at the heart of González Torres' practice. The works are sensual. As the artist flirtatiously stated, I am giving you this sugary thing. You put it in your mouth and you suck on someone else's body for a few seconds. I've put something sweet in someone's mouth, and that is very sexy. As discussed by Helen Molesworth, the decisions that the audience are faced with to directly engage with the artwork, the invitation to take a piece of candy and eat it, or to keep it as a souvenir, a memento, This disallows the neutrality of the viewer. This is the strength of the interactivity of the works. They force the audience to make choices, to participate or not. And it is this personal engagement which allows some part of the work to remain alive. As a choice is made, active or not, the candy spills are completed by what the visitors bring to them. And they enable the audience members who participate to grasp what it means for something to be temporary, to enjoy, to savor, and then to let go. The tension is brought by the inevitability. Our very own demise also signifies that we live. One implicitly invokes the realization of the other's state. While sucking on or pocketing a sweet, we are enabled to grasp a little piece of death. Motoi Yamamoto's salt works are as follows. Picture a floor covered by a large, intricate white drawing of crashing and twisting wave-like structures. It's like a mandala that has been thought up by Escher, made out of salt. From a distance, the viewer takes on the full scale an image as when you see a Monet from a distance, or when leaning in close, perhaps kneeling, the details, the grit, and the texture of the drawing become apparent. A faint metallic smell permeates the space. Yamamoto paints, as he describes it, large and intricate floor drawings with salt, a symbol of purification and memory in Japan. He completes these salt installations over a period of days or weeks, depending on the scale and intricacy of the project. They are then left displayed, relatively stable, for a predetermined period, after which a dismantling ceremony takes place. Yamamoto's salt works are memorials for the artist's lost sister. He began making them in response to and as a way of coping with her death. Relating back to the idea of art as experience, Yamamoto describes his work as being a way to try to recall memories of his sister. For the viewer, they also present an experience in which the known inevitability of the work's destruction, to which they may or may not be privy, makes the work a memory in the making. The work is born from the artist's nostalgia, but is also further shaped by the viewer's nostalgia in the making. As part of the completion of the work, for its so-called dismantling ceremony, the artist invites the public to move through the work, breaking the salt drawing apart. Hands and feet move and stretch across the floor, and children wriggle in the crystals. The initial clean, repetitive, and almost sterile lines become vast smears across the surface. In the end, nothing is left of the drawing but streaks of salt spread by mass bodily interaction, like an ode to Jackson Pollock's action painting or Yves Klein's anthropometries. To conclude the work, Yamamoto makes a final call for a return to sea, in which participants who have helped unmake the drawing are asked to take handfuls of salt and return them to a body of water. The process of unmaking is critical for the work to be completed. It is part of what ultimately shapes and enables it to come full cycle. Material unmaking, as discussed here, can be seen as a vehicle for loss, both of the physical work and as a means to engage with broader themes that deal with loss as a concept. However, the theme of loss should not necessarily be simplified and understood as merely mournful. While the candy spills and saltscapes both deal with death, they are also ignited and completed by connection. The audience is an essential part of completing the work, carrying it both full circle and forward. They require the audience's collaboration and commitment to remembering the work, sustaining it long after it is physically gone. The audience alters the work, and the work alters the audience. This lingering connection, the inevitably absent work, plays with what Severin Fowles discusses as the carnality of absence. A clarification of what is missing assists in sustaining what I would describe as this performance of loss. A physical change both contextualizes the work's presence as well as its loss. It is a staging of what cannot last. Absences have physical consequences and resonances. As Fowles elaborates, when absences become object-like, they seem to exist not merely as an afterthought of perception, but rather of self-standing presences out there in the world. They begin to acquire powers and potentialities similar to things. This points to the crucial notion that one can experience absence as much as one can experience an object. As such, this proposes that negative space speaks as loudly, if not louder than, the space filled by material. In relation to ephemeral artworks, this presents the interesting idea that these types of works are first experienced in their material presence, and as they are physically unmade, can also be experienced in their absence. A lot of the works that I've looked at throughout my career have been things that I have not managed to witness firsthand, but they still feel like old friends. The process of material unmaking brings to light this impending physical fracturing, and the later physically absent object continues to echo that there was once something material that did not last. It is a point of orientation, and it's also an invitation to inquiry. Life will break you. Art can serve as a lens to help frame the fractures and find depth in the multitudes that are left behind, as well as foster connection. And therein, I would propose, lies the sweetness to temper the bitter. Let's eat all of the apples, tart, sweet, tender. All right, guys.
Sophie, thank you very much for that. It's wonderful. Some beautiful images there, and I can already, as you finish talking, they're kind of lingering in their kind of non-materiality in my mind. So
Yeah.
it's a curious provocation. That's the idea of something being more present in its absence, and in the sense of it once having been, as opposed to it still being here. Thank you. We're actually running a little ahead of schedule, so if you do have a few more minutes, if there's anything that you'd like to follow that up with.
That's I'm happy to kind of leave it there, so I'm happy to take questions now or later as well.
Leave it there. Okie doke. Bear with me one sec. I just want to check that we've got, is Beatrice present? Ready to sort of kick off at 11:45 or shortly before then. Beatrice, hello, hi. Welcome.
Hello.
hello. Are you in a position to kind of to crack on now, and we will kind of leave sort of questions and comments until everybody's had an opportunity to present. So you happy to sort of pick up the baton now, or would you like to kind of a little bit more of a pause before heading before starting off?
I thought Matt indicated that we were going to have questions after each person. Apologies.
That's my mistake. Apologies.
Is that?
That is, yeah, that was me not me having missed that bit, but we can absolutely do that. So in that case,
I'll go away.
We have about 5 minutes or so for a few questions. If anyone has any questions, you can pop them into the Q&A thread that's just at the top of the the chat stream here, and we can then we can pass them on to Sophie there. But I guess, Sophie, maybe I'll start by saying I love how you described some of the artworks you've encountered as old friends, and I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that and how they remain with you.
I mean, it's, you know, this kind of this fascination of dealing with stuff, I think, comes from like a lot of different things for me. Like, in part, just I come from what I always think of as a family of collectors.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I grew up in a house that was just filled with weird series of things. My mother had a vintage lattice collection. I remember when my parents split up, I'd always known that we had 2 whale's teeth. It turned out we had 5. And so I've been very interested in objects and kind of how they become touch points for stories. But yeah, and letting go is something that I, as a human being, find incredibly hard. You know, I notice that when I get anxious, my grip tightens rather than loosening. But it was really kind of when I started lecturing that I became interested in a lot of the works that I found really powerful and really challenging. Was just, I used to have a rule with first year art history students that whatever they were going to talk about, I wanted them to have gone to see, because it became quite interesting for me, realizing that students who went to art school went to look at things, art history students, certainly where I was teaching, didn't. And so there was always the prompt of, I want you to go and see it. I want you to kind of look at what's there and the color and the texture, and I want you to be so close you could lick it. But realizing that a lot of these works I was really interested in were things that existed for such small time frames that by the time that I started talking about them or sharing them, you know, scaling, they were no longer physically there in the manifestations that they'd been there, but still powerful, and trying to figure out, you know, how do you hold on to things that require unconventional strategies?
Yes. How do you hold on to things that require unconventional strategies?
Absolutely. Also, Matt, I'll send you a link to the rest of that piece from Dan Falk. Just I'm seeing Dan's question there as well.
Yes. Matt is here and he's listening very attentively. He's typing away his keyboard. He's there. There he is.
I'd love to ask a question in person, but I'll mute until it's the time. Thank you, Sophie.
Yeah. Also, if anyone is feeling shy or anything pops up later, feel free to send me a little DM or send me an email later. I'm usually quite chatty.
Thank you, Sophie. That's wonderful. Great. In that case, yes, as we don't have any more questions that have come through. Beatrice does.
Not so much a question, Sophie, as just a thought. Something struck me in your words was material perishes, and so do we, and yet the material or the affective import of the material lives on in the audience. So I was just really struck by that. I wondered if you wanted to say any more about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit of an idea that I kind of work with as well, as the idea, especially for ephemeral pieces, that the audience and the indirect audience, you know, I talk sometimes in my work about, you have firsthand audiences, but then you also have secondhand audiences, you know, which, like a game of Chinese whispers, kind of take on different parts of the piece, become what I would deem unintentional archivists. You know, you kind of become responsible for it. And like with all problematic archives, there's inclusion and exclusion, but yeah, these pieces stay with you, and you talk about them, and as you share them, then they go into someone else's archive, and so we carry on. And what I like about that idea of the unintentional archivist also is the fallibility of memory, which I don't think is bad. You know, I think the richness and the idea also of the contextualization of a piece is part of its necessary weaving of storytelling. I think that's okay.
Yeah. moves through bodies, transversal in that way.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Oh, Matt, I see you've got a question. This is a long question. It's going to take me a second to read this. Oh, yeah. I mean, I haven't thought about self-organizing public rituals in this sense as much, but I think about the boundaries of where something becomes an artwork and where it isn't a lot. Like authorship, and like this is a discussion I have with my mother quite a lot, and sort of people that come to interact with us, where my mom and I will often exclaim, she's a practicing artist, and we'll say, oh, this is like an artwork, and occasionally friends who are maybe not as engaged with the arts will say, come on. But I think those boundaries of where things become performance and where things become art are interesting, and I don't think we have to draw as tight lines around it as we sometimes do. And I think especially if we challenge museum spaces a little bit and authorship, I think there's a real richness and playfulness that can be found in that as well.
That really is an area that fascinates me as well. Not really academically, I haven't done any sort of research about it, just personally, the way in which as the art world over the past sort of 40, 50 years has naturally extended its boundary to include lots of behaviours that weren't normally labelled as art. There becomes a really interesting edge around those kind of behaviours, where if you call them art, how does that affect their function? And obviously tying on a clouts as
things becoming precious,
Yeah. There's a really interesting kind of slightly hot dialogue around it in Cornwall, where I live, because you get teams who are they look after those ancient sites that I was referring to, the holy wells, the pugus, and so they'll go and clean away all the plastic, and people hang up, CDs and plastic ribbons and things like that then just stay there and glitter. So is that a kind of violation of other people's sacred ritual, or is it a preservation of a sacred site? And they just interest me because I do work with and meet a lot of artists doing similar things with public rituals, but I'm interested in the ones that nobody does on purpose, and maybe they've got a slightly sentimental sort of nostalgic narrative attached to them, but I'm more interested in the behaviour than the narrative. Anyway. It was obliquely relevant to your talk. Your talk was great. Thank you. I'm really going to have to go back and watch the first part on the. Okay. Sorry. So, I'm going to mute so I can.
Oh, that's a-okay. I think it's material is exciting, and things that are difficult are exciting. I think for lots of us, they become touch points just to, that whole idea of when we try to constrain things, what do they tell us about what I think of as the living thing in flight, and there's so many places to move from that. But I don't want to take time away from the next person. But if anybody has any musings, do feel free to get.
Oh, thanks so much, Sophie. That's wonderful. And yes, as Sophie said, please do, feel free to kind of continue contributing to the chat and to contact Sophie directly if you've got any further questions or comments. Beatrice, it's over to you.
Thank you. I'm going to share the screen. Delighted to be here. Thank you for inviting me, and it was great to be able to share the film yesterday. So that the film Moving with the Trouble is embedded in a wider research context, which I'm going to speak a little bit about today. So my presentation today will draw from recent publications and my second book, which will be around the Moving Kinship Project, which is a feminist new materialist transdisciplinary way of working that brings together artistic and psychotherapeutic and scientific perspectives. And I'm seeking to evolve a more than human ways of tackling societal challenges and cultivating a trauma-informed anti-oppressive practice. So I want to start, before I delve into the Moving Kinship project and present a mini case study from that, I'd like to start with my Femmaterial Mobius strip. Femmaterialism is a neologism coined by Jessica Ringrose and others. So fem refers to the blend of post-humanism and the new materialist movement. And this particular and specifically commissioned drawing by the artist Neil Max Emanuel appears in one of my publications. And it offers a starting point. I use it often in teaching, a starting point for discussion around the human environmental relations. And it's in a sense, it's an image for me of a tangled ontology, or as Karen Barad would say, a tangled ethico-onto-epistemology. And it highlights the ethics and politics of how we come to know through movement. And I hope to elaborate on that as I go on over the next, what are we now, 18 minutes, countdown on my clock. So the upshot really, as I allow you to just dwell on this image, is that we're more than our bodies. We are, in Erin Manning's sense, bodying. It's an action. And this seems to me a continuum where bodies, human and non-human, more than human, and environments are entangled in an infinite loop of language, biology, affect, cognition, body politics, power structures, the natural world, and more. So all these things are given equal value. And one thing I want to say before I move on around the Mobius, and a crucial aspect for me is body politics, so the non-neutrality of our bodies and our unique and intersecting signatures of gender, race, sex, sexuality, class, disability, age, home, place, space, technologies. So our body politics, in effect, are constantly impacting on our daily lives and social practices. And power and privilege and trauma are thus embodied. And marginalized groups experience close and continued trauma through the systemic structures of oppression. So the work I present here today with families affected by rare, early onset or young onset dementia explores how to create a space to transform traumatic experiences of precariousness, vulnerability, and depression into states of possibility. And as I hope to demonstrate, an understanding of how everyday experiences of oppression can be transformed further through dance into micro acts of activism. So the Moving Kinship project is could be described as a transcorporeal micro activism, a methodology that I've been developing that engages with the inseparability of bodies, culture, history, discourses, and biology, and the natural environment. And it's a project with various funders across the arts, health, and science sectors that aims to create bespoke dance theatre performances for and with families affected by young onset dementia. So in 2016, I established regular Moving Kinship hubs for families living with, where one person in the family was living with young onset dementia in North and Southwest London. And different iterations of the hubs have expanded across Surrey and internationally in Norway and Japan, and an Australian hub is planned for 2023. So just a brief word about dementias, the plural as an umbrella term, vary greatly according to each individual. And a significant impairment of memory, language, comprehension and speaking, reasoning and judgment and visual perception are seismic embodied shifts. And social, psychological and political issues of equality, autonomy, dignity, social inclusion and solidarity have been raised in relation to people living with the dementias, but less attention is paid to the role of the moving expressive body and to creative processes. in advancing issues of social justice and health, particularly in relation to health inequalities. So an aim of the Moving Kinship Project is to investigate how our collaboration allows people affected by young onset dementia and their families to understand and deepen their capacity to engage with life and kinship bonds in co-creative, collective and accessible ways and sustainable ways. So it's worth saying also that some of the professional artists in my team have, and some of whom you saw in the film yesterday, also have parents who live or have lived with young onset dementia. And since the project began in 2016, it's also spanned the deaths of 3 parents in the team, including my father, and a pandemic, of course. So together we are all working on emergence and doing the work of grief, as it has impacted us individually. And we're reconnecting with who we are now during a global pandemic, and the tangled relating with families that underscores this project is supporting us to do that. So I'm going to give you an overview of the components of the project, of the Moving Kinship methodology, with a case study example. And this artistic psychotherapeutic methodology has been honed so that insight and knowledge is imbricated, and each layer speaks to each other. So I'm going to present it in a linear way, but it's not necessarily in this linear fashion. So the first phase, the first aspect, is kinesthetic listening. So kinesthesia, the traditional, of course, understanding of kinesthesia definition is this sense of movement. And I've just queered it a bit. So my neologism kinesthesia include. Oh, there's somebody. I can hear somebody in the background. My neologism kinesthesia includes interoception, of course, so that internal bodily sensation, as well as external bodily sensation, proprioception, and the material kinship that emerges between people dancing, and its more than human, ethical and political dimensions. So the first phase of the Moving Kinship Project involves what I describe as interview conversations with families in their homes. And I visit, part choreographer, part psychotherapist, part researcher. I listen with movement. I listen kinesthetically as stories, fragments, snippets, traumas and memories unfold, spoken with more than human metaphors about tsunamis, violent contact sports, and fascist regimes. And with this gesture of listening, I experience movement of breath in my own and speakers' bodies. I see eyes widen and narrow. I see body shapes adjust, shrinking or expanding in tandem with the effective layers of what's being expressed. And I'm reminded of one of the first people I worked with, Yvonne, who lives with primary progressive aphasia, a form of dementia where language is progressively impaired. Yvonne asks me to finish her words if she cannot find them. And as I sit in the kitchen with her, in her kitchen, I listen, gaze fixed on her face, and participate in storing her sometimes chaotically formed past and present identities. At some point during our exchange, Yvonne viscerally reveals her stunning desire. I'm grabbing the time that I have left. And in these interview conversations, I also listen to the body politics of family life. So couples in midlife, single mothers with adult children caring for them, all trying to make sense of living with dementia and how this affects their intimate relationships and everyday material engagements. In most instances, participants waive their right to anonymity so that they can be heard and seen and can contribute to wider and collective understandings about living with young onset dementia. And these insights are from people who want their experiences to be heard and seen, for whom everyday life is an act of resistance. And the next phase is working with the material. So drawing from transcribed interview conversations and my own effective movement responses, I work in the studio with a team of professional dancers, some of whom you saw in the film yesterday. and a musician, and we co-compose bespoke performances for each family. We shape the impact of this material on our own bodies through a kinesthetic storying a family's life material. So the choreography evolves with the dancers' individual styles, and as a team, we notice the impact of the themes on our own bodies. This means the focus is not on the story being told, but on the depth of experience. And recently, earlier this year, I presented the Moving Kinship Project to a group of NHS clinicians who were supporting us with referrals. One psychiatrist asked me, how do you deal with the dark material that the work stirs up? So I think such depth of experience is required, above all else, that we move with and through the trouble, necessarily a partial process of forming bodily congruence with our sense of interiority. An opening of the family crypt, as Frosch has it in psychoanalytical terms, and I quote, a space that gives protection to unbearable secrets, but that also functions as a point of resistance and disturbance. So working with the material in the studio is a trans-affective disturbance that cascades into the bespoke performances that we make for families. And then the next phase of the hub is the live hub, if you like, with participants. I call the space where we come together with families to share the bespoke performances a participatory ecology. After Erin Manning, a participatory ecology touches on the everyday while moving beyond the individual and beyond the event. And in Moving Kinship, the bespoke choreographic and sonic material is followed by an invitation for families to join us in a collective, often playful, improvisational movement response. We are, as Daniel Stern would say in psychological terms, feeling with each other's stories or effectively attuning through kinesthetic engagement. And the process involves a co-creative and recursive loop of performing, witnessing, and moving. And during this process, kinship is generative. It extends beyond the immediate family ties to other families in the room, the artistic team, and with the choreographic material and all the more than human forces that the material evokes. The loop begets visibility. Witnessing their own bespoke performances invites participants to see aspects of themselves and their seemingly ineffable dark material articulated, offering a way to engage with the kinesthetic import of the material in a number of ways, in multiple ways. So there's a radical intimacy in this process. It highlights how autobiographical dementia stories chime with wider socio-political and ecological taboos about what constitutes kinship, identity, age, loss, language, care. In contrast to biomedical prognosis of silence, language impairment, and solipsism, this process focuses on the kinship that emerges not only between the people dancing and its ethical and political dimensions, but with the ever-shifting process of relating with the kinesthetic material itself. So a recent example of this radical intimacy was our online hub via Zoom platform with V, a woman living with young onset dementia who has a partner and 2 young children. A mother, a wife, a working professional. Our interview conversation shored up taboos hidden in the family crypt, a bittersweet memory of a cherished father who is not long dead. Although the word dementia is never uttered, I learned that he too lived with Alzheimer's. A conversation about violence of rugby game, and it became a metaphor for neurological damage. And these organismic traumas find their way into my co-creative process with Rudzani, Luke, Anetta, and Takeshi. I invite the dancers to materialize the theme of taboo. Rudzani's deliberate hand on the floor sweeping gesture gives rise to questions. Look at me, she says. Can you hear my voice? Mantra-like, her questioning seems to be touching the alterity within. inviting us to move with her as she moves with the trouble. I realize that this work is all about fine-tuning our attention to how we work with the dark matter. Luke repeatedly covers his eyes and face with sudden and forceful arm movements. Annetta confronts the unknown other through a violent whole-body shaking that culminates in a warrior clenched fist, eventually softening and opening. Takeshi grasps this fist, the taboo, and plays with it. It takes on an agentic force, as if separate from the rest of his body. We are worlding this darkness. This is a collective endeavor. The possibility that V's pain is dispersed through all our bodies. So by moving with this trouble, we're confronted with the ethics of engagement. How much do we present for V in her bespoke 20-minute performance? And notwithstanding the implications of working in a digitally mediated way with such intimate material, I facilitate this online hub. Accompanied by Rob's original music played live, the event was a bit of a technical feat, unimaginable pre-pandemic. Not saying I wouldn't even have countenanced it, I think, pre-pandemic. And yet my desire to connect was really precisely because the pandemic has uprooted all sorts of conceptions of age, loss, pain, isolation, and death, whilst also presenting connection and interaction in new ways. So as we navigated the technologically mediated space where micro movements of all our facial expressions were writ large in a giant digital mother mirror with motor neurons firing, V listens with and to movement, and her effective response is visceral. Her quiet, steady voice moves through the screen in waves, shaping the words in short sentences and poetic phrasing. She says, this poignant. I think it's what you've put out is, I think it's work very well done, because you put in some quirky bits and that alleviates it's one of those things that I've known all this time. It's there, but when you really shove it in your face, it's bigger than I've been. A fuck tsunami on your head and your children's heads. In becoming undone, as Judith Butler would say, V bravely remained within her effective window of tolerance, and staying with the discomfort that this movement evoked allowed for a micro act of activism for her. V was faced with the paradoxical sense of dispossession. She is becoming lost to herself as her dementia progresses, and she articulates this clearly. It's bigger than I've been. V is grieving for what is and the version of herself that would have been, and what she cannot be for her children. This is her fuck tsunami. In seeing and being seen, V experienced a somatic marker, as Damasio would say, a neural marker of bodily representation. And through this doing, a kinesthetic knowing was strikingly distributed between V and all of us. Listening with movement is an act of touch, where we've reached each other across the digital divide. In our debriefing after the hub, the dancers' responses captured the consequences of our having ventured into the forest with the more than human. Bodies leak, affect diffracts. Our hauntings are part of our future present. As Rudzani asks, oh no, what have we done? This is a bad idea. And then I began to realize that we've got no control over how our material is interpreted. Here I simultaneously hear Barad's words that matter is never settled. It is always radically open. And so our effective traces move like this, with Takeshi speaking of honesty. I thought what we presented was honest to ourselves, and I think that also allowed V to be really honest. Not everybody is able to express the extent of that tsunami. And Annetta, bringing us back to the profundity of touching the stranger within. I had the feeling that V touched something. I liked that she was so honest. Maybe we hurt her in some way, or she touched herself in some painful place. But in some way, it might be just my own pain. This bodily excavation of thoughts, words, and sensations seems to have materialized the ghosts more fully into the light of day. I'm struck how V seemed riveted throughout the performance, and by Luke's observation that V was different, a different person in the beginning and then after. It doesn't have to be beautiful. It doesn't always have to be nice. I'm left with an acute sense of staying with more and more questions rather than seeking solutions, and how such autobiographical tangling demonstrates the plasticity of our anatomies, how our material aesthetics beget micro changes, how dementia is our teacher for living. So I'm going to conclude, just fly through these images of also part of this wider project is the production I've Lost You Only to Discover That I've Gone Missing, a 75-minute immersive dance theatre performance which emerges from the participatory ecologies and the material therein.
Dodgy connection quite a bit.
And of course the film that some of you may have seen yesterday, Moving with the Trouble. So this body of artistic work is also a material archive. The legacy of people's experiences and stories is presented and embodied in the work for wider audiences to bear witness. So to conclude, with thoughts about the ethical imperative of moving kinship with the more than human, it yields constantly renewable kinesthetic insights and neurodiverse ways of relating. And in this way, dementia and any other so-called diagnosis becomes an ecological process distributed in the environment rather than a pathological manifestation of the human subject. When stories of crisis and othering become part of us, as they do ubiquitously in art, therapy, and everyday life, we must cultivate the capacity for responsibility. And this is our moving kinship, a potent form of microactivism that nourishes equitable citizenship and counter-hegemonic and ecological narratives of aging, agency, illness, vulnerability, living and dying. And moving with the trouble, with the dark material in collective ways is also, I think, a decolonizing of the hypercognitive view that holds currency in the global north, where, of course, neoliberal ideals permeate education and health and arts policies that tend to cultivate a culture of anthropocentric individualism. So moving kinship invites a kinesthetic experience, a response to moving with the complexity of the more than human in everyday life, dancing with more than human others enacts subtle and incremental changes and makes spaces for our unimagined hopes. Thank you for listening.
Beatrice, thank you very much for that. Apologies, I had terrible connection throughout that and was dropping in and out, and you may have heard my voice at a few inopportune moments, so I really hope that didn't intrude on the presentation. Thank you. Let me just see if we've checked to see what we've had in the way of questions and comments come through. Just a reminder, oh, there we go. Let's have a look. So we have one here from Aubrey, who says, wonderful talk, thank you for your work, I found very moving. Can you please share more about your inspiration for work with this population in particular?
Thank you, Aubrey. Sure. So I started actually very early on in my clinical psychotherapy work. Over 20 years ago, I worked in as well as an adult mental health, running groups in adult mental health. I worked in an outpatient dementia unit, an NHS outpatient dementia unit. And so that was my first experience of dementia. And I became very interested in how present we were all able to be in the room with our own kinesthetic relating, and how through touch and song, through being together, through moving together, that often triggered sometimes verbal responses, but certainly a relational presence in the moment. Often in dementia, there's talk about people experiencing fleeting moments of being present. So we were experiencing that. And I became very interested also in the sense of, I think since both of my parents are no longer alive, and I'm learning to be in the world without my parents, and noticing, as I was saying earlier, what that sense of dispossession means, and that paradoxical sense of dispossession. Where have I gone now that my relationship with them in the living corporeal realm is no longer present, but something else is present. And I see that in dementia too. So I became very interested in how that's very apparent for the person actually living with dementia. That paradoxical sense of knowing that their own process, if you like, of dying, and maintaining that sense of reconnection with self in spite of that.
Got a couple more questions appeared in the chat. Matt, I think, has one for you and is able to grace us with his actual presence to ask it again.
Thank you, Beatrice. That was really a beautiful talk, and I pretty much managed to get all of it this time, despite sort of popping in and out like a fidget to kind of restore bandwidth, getting better as we go. I was really interested. Obviously, I'd seen your abstract, but the way round we came at this really suited me. I was really happy that we sort of saw the film first yesterday, and it really struck me. I just went home thinking about that film and was sort of woke up thinking about it. It was really it just landed on me. And I think partly because I'd come from the talk with Bio, it struck me when you were talking that although I found the words very provocative in the film, and that simple replacement of staying with moving was just like a real, oh yes, yeah, that I felt like that's interesting. I went somewhere with a kind of cognitive interpretation of the dance that was, if you like, completely erroneous, or it was just kind of me going off down a rabbit hole that you haven't mentioned, so I assume is not there. And I just was interested in that relationship between the role the work performs and how it acts on us and what it does for us, and how important it is that we know what's in the what's baked into your intention, or the dancer's intentions. Does that question make sense?
Yeah, I'm sort of having a bit of a delusion line of flight with it, and I was kind of somewhere with what you were saying, going down the rabbit hole. Was that and your cognitive response, was that once you'd heard the words?
I think that I saw the clothes as small children's clothes. And I went from there. So from the moment that I understood them to be children's clothes, because of their small size, I was going down a kind of loss of child, loss of stillbirth, that kind of that route. And I thought that was speculative, but it struck me now that it was probably not just speculative. It was just entirely sort of something I cooked up my end. But that doesn't. I'm not sort of apologising for it really. It's just because I think that's really interesting, and it's what I knew was that it moved me, and the rest feels secondary to that. So it's optional.
It moved you. So I think that I and please come in if you want to tease out more points, because I'm hearing about the layers of affective import that any artwork can have, and I think for me, because this project has been so layered and it's really spanned some years, we've worked with so many people. We've had our own, as a team, our own experiences, which are diffracting and entangled with all of this process. So we're all living it on so many layers. And the film yesterday, that Moving with the Trouble. It's interesting I'm saying the film yesterday because it's the film today as well, and it'll be the film tomorrow. But there's something about my my intention in the creation of that particular film as a punctuation mark, as a punctuation in this whole process, as a sort of a delving into the river, which is the most difficult thing to do, to pull out an aspect of the process of the rapidly flowing water, is to exactly allow people to simply dwell on what appears, to access an affective register or registers that perhaps remain a little bit buried or a little unconscious, and for us to then open that up and to notice, to simply notice what that does to our somatic or our embodied knowing of who we think we are in any given moment. So that there's something about how we do that together, how we open that crypt in a sense together.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I nearly didn't ask the question because it seems such a sort of rookie question, like what's it all about? Do I need to understand it? But I think that's a really great answer. Thanks.
Mm.
Thanks, Matt, and thank you again, Beatrice. So it's just gone 20 past, so I think we perhaps need to draw a line under the questions there. I've seen that Heidi is around, but we don't have a Caroline yet. So Matt, sorry, you're...
I was just thinking, welcome Heidi. Great you're here. Just while we wait, I've seen June has said, sorry, there's not time for all questions, only those of presenters and people on the screen. And I think that might be a misunderstanding caused by the slightly chaotic negotiation of bandwidth by the chairs and stewards between me and Carrie. But anyone could ask a question, and if we missed a question, that may obviously sometimes the time to ask more questions just run out. When Bio's talk finished yesterday, I had about 10 more questions I didn't get to. So if anyone wanted to ask Beatrice another question while we wait, we maybe hold it for now so we don't just sort of go backwards. But there's a long break after this session finishes, so we could just keep the session open, and if anyone hasn't asked a question and they'd like to come back with it, they could do so at the end to any of the panelists, I'm sure.
Okay, we're here to talk with Heide Hatry about the wonderful portraits in ash that she's been making. And so the first question to ask is, Heide, what led you to the idea of making the portraits in ash?
On July 19th in 1993, I received a phone call that my father had died under very strange circumstances, which for me clearly indicated suicide. And I was in total shock, and I wanted to talk about it. Nobody would or could talk, and I felt completely alone with my grief. And my solution was trying to just not think about it at all. In 2008, 15 years later, I received a similar call. One of my closest friends in Germany had committed suicide. It was totally unexpected. I was in shock, and immediately reminded me of my dad. And with that, an enormous amount of unresolved grief hit me. And I was utterly distraught. I didn't know what to do. And I certainly didn't want to get in a situation again in which I had been 15 years ago. But at that time, I was an artist, and I had been an artist for several years, and I made portraits out of beeswax. And I want to show you, I had a board of wood which was covered with beeswax, and I placed pigments on the beeswax in the shape of a face, and covered that with another layer of wax and another layer of pigments, and then another layer of wax. And I built this up until it looked realistic and even a little bit 3D. I have actually a picture right here when you can see this, a picture made out of wax, you can see the glossiness a little bit. It looks now with the light a little bit like a doll, but it is a relatively realistic picture. And it is made, I was talking about these pigments, and it is made out of pigments. I don't know if everybody of you has seen pigments. They look sometimes like sand, sometimes they are a little coarser and look like dust. And I realized that this is cremated remains, looks just like pigments. And therefore, I had this idea to combine that. I could make his portrait by using his ashes instead of pigments. And it took me many months to figure out how to make that, because I had this clear idea of how it should look like. I mean, I had this idea that it's like a grainy photograph from further away, but if you would go closer, you would see like a sandy surface of this pigment. And in order to do that, I had to have dark and bright pigments to work with it. And I realized that inside of the bone, it's a little darker. Outside of the bone, it's a little brighter. And so I separated all these pigments into different shades of gray. And then I inserted the single particles with a scalpel into the surface, which I had slightly heated so that it becomes a little bit sticky. And what I basically did was creating a mosaic. And I covered the entire surface with thousands of particles. And the wax, you couldn't see anymore, only the ashes were visible. And at the same time, I tried, of course, to achieve an exact likeness of my father and my dad. And I want to show you how that looked like. It looks like this is my friend Stefan. And this was my dad.
So I wanted to ask how the power of these images relates to a question that art historians have been thinking about a good deal lately. They've been worrying about representation. They've been worrying about likeness, what makes something like something else. If Picasso makes a picture of Dora Maar, she's only got one eye, is this like his lover or not? And it struck me in thinking about your portraits in ash, that what you've got is sort of radical likeness and radical unlikeness, and that this is part of the power. These are portraits made from photographs, so they are very like. At the same time, the power of the fact that they're made from ash is that this is the real person. It's not like the person at all. The ashes are the person. And so you've got likeness and being, if you will. You've got what the philosopher Peirce would call icon and index. You've got likeness and you've got the thing itself combined in these very unique objects that you've made. And I wonder if the thinking of it as, if you will, likeness and being, if that's any help in thinking about these portraits.
Mm-hmm. This is actually exactly what I think is the interesting thing about these ash portraits. Sorry. I was asked before why it is so important for me to replicate the face. Why be so literal? And in my opinion, it's necessary that the portrait is realistic as possible, because the face is where we understand communication is happening, and the face is the template of for capturing all subtleties of what makes us human. So an ash portrait is the representation of the person, meaning you can recognize him or her because of the likeness, but at the same time, it is made out of the person's ashes. And that means it is actually that person. And at the beginning, I thought the long contemplative process of making the portrait made me feel so extremely consoled and comforted. But I realized later that that wasn't true, that I found when I had the picture, I found the picture itself is consoling. The presence of the beloved one is consoling, meaning the ashes itself are consoling. And that is the reason why I actually can make these portraits for other people to help them with their grief, because they don't have to go through the process. They don't have to be able to make this kind of likeness. They can have just the consoling benefit in having that portrait. Caroline, can you say something about your medieval reliquaries, and if or are they also both like or not like?
Yes, when we first did our conversation together 2 years ago, I was asked if I could make some comments from the standpoint of a medievalist who works on various kinds of ways of memorialization and remembering, and especially on relics. And one of the things I did was to talk about a reliquary which is here in New York at the Metropolitan Museum. I hope I can show you the image. Yes, this is the Mary Magdalene reliquary in the Metropolitan Museum. You can see here the fragment in the center is the Magdalene, supposedly the Magdalene's tooth, and it is in rock crystal, a very, very, very hard substance, the hardest substance that they had in the Middle Ages. And at the same time surrounded by these wonderful elements of foliage that are unfolding, that are organic, that are living, that are fertile. And I think there are some parallels between this kind of thing and Heide's portraits in ash. Now, obviously, this is not like the Magdalene in the same way that the portrait of Stephan is like Stephan. But one could say that to somebody who came to Stephan's portrait, it might not seem to be Stephan, because they might have known another Stephan, a Stephan at age 2 or a Stephan at age 14. And so the fact that the portrait freezes one moment in Stephan's life might have seemed unlike as well as like to them. And I think then that there might be some parallels to the way in which this is like and unlike the Magdalene. Obviously, her tooth is not the Magdalene. We don't know what Mary Magdalene looked like, but there is an element here that is indexical, that is really the Magdalene. It's the stuff of the Magdalene. And at the same time, there is an element of likeness in another sense, the sense in which the portrait of Stephan is comforting to Heide, and a portrait from another time in his life might be comforting to someone else, in the way in which it makes it alive. Because the interesting thing about the reliquary, and this is often true of medieval reliquaries, is that in a sense they make the person eternal. Because what we have here is the Magdalene made eternal in the sense of the hard crystal, to endure forever. And at the same time, the unfolding, the organic, the flowering, that presumably is also part of the life in heaven, which unfolds forever as a kind of way of the soul sort of blossoming. So I think there is a sense in which the medieval reliquary is like and unlike. It is the person, and at the same time, it's very much a construction of the person in ways that are comforting. There also are other Christian implications that I don't go into, but at the same time, I think anyone praying before the reliquary of the Magdalene might have some of the same kind of feelings that those who loved Stephan would have in front of the portrait in ash that Heide's made. I don't know whether that carries any significance to you, Heide, but you might want to jump off from the reliquary.
Yeah, I like the idea of a reliquary retaining ashes or retaining a
fragment, yeah. Piece.
Right, which is actually more customary with Europeans. And I don't like scattering ashes, which is more popular with Americans. For me, scattering the ashes feels like throwing them away or denying us access to our beloved ones. And I remember we talked about that before, and I was very impressed by what you said, and maybe it even changed my, not maybe, it even changed my view of that. But can you tell us what you like about scattering ashes, or just about scattering ashes?
Yeah, well, I think it's an interesting sort of European-American contrast in that in many European countries, you're required to buy an urn and a place in a columbarium, in other words, you're not allowed to scatter. In this country, one is allowed to scatter. Just down the road from me in Riverside Park, we are actually permitted to scatter ashes. This is part of the notice. You're not allowed to put them in water in the park, but you are allowed to scatter them in the grounds. And when my husband died 2 years ago, I scattered his ashes in the Hudson River, right in the middle where the current was. One of the reasons I did this is, of course, because that's what he wanted. And I think if one knows, it's helpful to be able to do what a person wants done with their bodies. But another way in which I think scattering, and in this case, scattering in water, but it can be just as much scattering in earth, it's giving the person back to the fertility of the world, a world which is at the moment for us very, very fragile, and which we hope will go on and be fertile. So there's a way in which scattering is giving the person back to the soil, the ashes, the earth, the planet from which ultimately we all come. Of course, in the Christian tradition too, there is the notion of the Last Judgment, and we have all sorts of powerful works of art and works of poetry in the Christian tradition, in which when the last trumpet sounds, the angel puts the person back together, no matter how far the fragments have been scattered. I think most people today find it very, very hard to encompass that in their mind. But I think there is a sense in which in the long Western tradition, maybe even scattering to the wind, scattering to the water, scattering to the earth, is not so much of being lost or being thrown away, although I can understand why it might feel like that, but rather a kind of a joining, a kind of return, which would ultimately also have to do with some kind of reassembling or putting back together, or sort of joining the earth again.
Yeah.
So that, I think, that talks a little bit about the power of scattering, but I think there also, of course, is a power in retaining. And you, I think, might want to talk a little bit more about why having Stefan present, having your father present in the portrait is important and moving.
Yeah, I never thought that I would find scattering the ashes moving. And it really changed our conversation, really changed my view of it. I think my portraits are a very special way of keeping the person present to those who loved him or her. But I don't believe that it doesn't have, I mean, it doesn't have to be that in that form. It doesn't have to be in the form of a portrait. And obviously the place where the dead still live is in our memories. Therefore, you could argue it doesn't matter at all. But for me, it does. And I feel like one potentially powerful access to memory is abandoned by scattering. and we have talked about that, and I found a kind of new argument which we didn't talk about, and therefore I want to ask that why do we have museums? I believe that there is an emotionally something in us that requires verification. Like objects are witnesses to an existence. We understand that these people or their objects actually existed in such a place or time, and we think that's the reason why we hold. I think that's the reason why we hold on to them and exhibit them and have them in museums or in our homes as witnesses. And I think an Icons in Ash portrait is a witness to that person, the truth that this person actually existed. Yeah. And there is even in the ashes, there's even the DNA, and it's the real thing. And another point I like about the portraits is that I'm returning these indistinguishable ashes into the particular. Mm-hmm. I think that is, I think that's beautiful. And in some ways, a lot of my work is about this reliteralizing, trying to return to the traumas or to the site of the traumas that have been subsumed in culture. And it seems to me to be a way of keeping alive what is always in danger to be lost or forgotten or ignored.
I think you're right, and in several ways. And I have to admit, even with the issue of my husband's ashes, after the scattering in the Hudson, I did save a little bit. And my daughter and I dedicated a bench to him in Riverside Park. And when spring came, I put the little bit of ashes that I had saved under the bench, so that the bench would be a place where I could go and sit, and a special place for locating memories, which is, of course, what the cemetery used to be. But now I think for modern Americans who travel so and move so, you can't really take a cemetery with you. Of course, you can't take a bench with you either. And one of the powerful things about portraits in ash would be you can take that with you. So this object of memory. And I do think that, Heide, you're absolutely right, that it is objects that carry memory for us. I still have hanging in my closet one of my husband's shirts. My cats, who missed him after he was gone, one of my cats went into the closet and tried to pull the shirt off the hanger. I think he was trying to find this person whom he had loved by pulling down the shirt. So I think objects do carry, and this, of course, is important about the medieval reliquaries too. They carried, and sometimes, of course, there are wonderful stories about how bones and other objects flew through the air and chose a place to be so that they could arrive and be there for people who wanted to retain memories. So yes, I think all of us want some way in which we let the people we love go. Mm-hmm. I think we have to let them go, let them join. Yep. A whole stream of history and of experience, but at the same time, I think you're absolutely right. We need to hang on to.
Yeah, my goal is actually to keep somebody permanently in my company, or that people can keep somebody permanently in their company, in the way that person looked like, and in the way what we have left, and if people have actually the ashes, that is just the closest thing. And I understand this code and clothing that that is an access we have much easier, and you don't have to do anything with that. But I also want to emphasize that what I do is an artwork, and an artwork has, in general, quite a strange relationship to us. So when we, for example, live with an artwork, much as with an actual personal relationship, we grow into it. Our relationship changes, and one day we might discover that the relationship that as it had existed is different, and we don't even discover that the relationship is different. It's just different. And I think these portraits tend to become part of our lives in that way, not desperately clinging to something that can no longer be, but a natural extension into the future of an important past. And the change, I think, happens in us, not in the thing, but we see it differently as we change. And you can, of course, argue that the scattered person has returned, and you said that before, to the universe, and it is in nature now and doing something there, kind of continues with life. And I think some people think that I'm anxious to that the physicality of that person escapes from me. I of course understand that the person is dead. I understood that very, very much when I worked with the ashes. But I think a portrait adds something to my inner personal life. Maybe like the scattered molecules add something to nature. It's a new perspective or a new relationship. And you could see my portraits maybe as a help for a transition. And it might not be for everybody. It's a specific way addressing profound grief, I believe. And maybe somebody is not ready for consigning the molecules to the nature yet. And for them, it might be better to have this portrait to get kind of from an emotional state to a kind of balance. More saying that it's not death and life. It's not this black and white thing. Death is a kind of slow mutation of life into a different sort of relationship. And what I like about my portraits is that death becomes a part of your life, instead of something that you just abandon or say it's over. It's, for me, it's a different way of saying goodbye in a kind of slower way. So I'm back.
Brilliant. Thank you, Heidi.
Matt.
Carrie, I'm muddling the chair up. I forgot that. Shall I just go with this?
Go with it, Matt. Go with it.
We're being a bit organic about the chairing role here, but yeah, thank you. That was really, really fascinating, and I'll have you here to speak for both halves of the conversation. We'll have you here to speak for both halves of the conversation. But really, really nice to have that form as well, just to have that kind of back and forth exchange with more than one point of view on things that I think a lot of us have been affected by personally as well. So it wasn't very much for me. It wasn't just a conversation about art. In fact, it wasn't even mainly a conversation about art for me, because what was happening was I was thinking about the times that I've scattered ash, the times that I've kept ash, and the times that I've buried people, and how different they've been, and how viscerally it's affected me. Actually, how more than I ever realized it would. And I'm guessing other people we started this slightly at different times, so it may be that some other people are still out there watching. So as a chair, I'm just going to kind of keep talking until somebody appears to come in and ask. I've seen June has said, I really did enjoy the conversation. Thanks, June. Maybe I'll just say, really interesting from an art point of view, but just kind of stepping around that to talk about that really interesting question, which I'd never thought about before, about the difference between a European predilection for kind of keeping and reliquarying in whatever form our loved ones and scattering them. I'm half American and half English, and I wonder if I could sort of feel both and have done both. And with my dad, did both, kept half and scattered half. With my dog, I kept her ashes, but never scattered them. And then with my mother-in-law, we buried her in a wicker casket, and that was the first time I ever myself lowered somebody into the ground. And after that, I was just stunned how the affect of that and the physicality of lowering the body into the ground, how different that was to burning. Probably partly because of the industrialization of the process here. So the local crematorium is a very impersonal place. That wasn't really a question, it was just a response. So I don't know if there's anything there you'd like to speak back to.
Yeah, I experienced all different things as well, and the most what comes to my mind when you said about lowering the casket, I have for the first time experienced somebody who was not embalmed and not cremated, just kept at home for 5 days, and all friends could come and say goodbye to the actual body. And that was very touching to me, because it was a really different way of saying goodbye. You had the feeling you can say goodbye in a way to the body, and it was incredible. And I believe that the reason why we do this embalming stuff is that this original feeling of saying goodbye to the body was so powerful that they wanted to kind of recreate that, so that the body would still be there and you could still say goodbye, but the body would be kind of not disturbing, and also preserved for being able for people to come later on. So I found that interesting. And there are in this new death movement in America, there's, for example, Caitlin McDonough, and she has this. She does a lot of things, like Talking to the Mortician is a podcast, and from her I learned that it is not important to call immediately the funeral home and say, here is an emergency, take that body away, but that it is really makes really a difference if you sit with the dead person.
Yeah, fascinating. That's great. I'm wanting to come and follow that through, but also aware that there's another question now, so I should let chair role take over. And Beatrice has. I must have got echo coming back there. Beatrice asks. She says, "Thank you, Heidi. A fascinating artistic process. Can you say more about the role of witness? You mentioned possibly the portrait being a witness to the person."
Yeah, I mean, I came up with this witness idea, is that we have something left of that person. This portrait shows not only that the person existed, like a photograph, and a lot of people choose a photograph as a witness, but this is a kind of double witness. It is a photograph, a photographic image where you actually can see how the person really looked like and recognize that person. And at the same time, it is the material, which is a witness, because you can actually see the DNA, or if you took a piece of the ashes off and tried to figure out who that was, you could find the DNA in the cremated remains. So it is both ways a witness, and I find that I don't even know if I understood that in a way before I made these portraits, or I didn't understand it. But this enormous effect of the portraits, which I saw with friends and with other people, that they are so consoling, and that they are changing your feeling towards the dead person, that you have this feeling, you have some kind of access to that person again, that you feel some kind of a presence of that person. That is just amazing and surprising to me.
That's great. Well, that feels like a really good place to wrap, and that's brought us to our time anyway. But that's that really extended it nicely, and actually really helped add to what you'd said in the film for me to really.
May I just realized that I totally forgot to say something in the presentation. I also made a book which is called Icons in Ash, and the front, if you touch the front, that is a picture which is printed onto sandpaper in order to give you a kind of similar feeling of the surface of the pictures. And I have invited in this book 27 writers to write something about death. So death-related things. So Lita Weintraub, who is also a part of this symposium and was talking at the same time on the main stage, she has an essay included in that book. And I just think it is interesting, these very different kinds of views from very different kind of people. It's not an art book. There are philosophers, psychologists, different people looking at death from different views. And I just wanted to mention that.
Maybe we could put a link to it on the expo. If you know what I mean by that. If you email over to Richard and Kat and the team, we can actually feature that. There's a kind of gallery space within the Hop-In event. So anything associated with that would be really nice to direct people directly to it.
And then I I forgot another thing. I wanted to mention another thing. I also do this for people who have pets. So this is, for example, a parrot of a friend whose little bones are used to make the portrait, or this is a friend's cat, or this is a dog. And our relationship to our pets is quite intense, and it's full of love, and it's really painful when pets leave us, because they were a part of our lives as a other human being, and sometimes even more intense than a person we don't have such a intense relationship to.
That's a nice lead to, I'm not sure if it's already happened, but I know there's at least one presentation specifically addressing that here. But I can't remember when in the summit it's happening. Because I haven't been to it. It may have already happened, but it'll be recorded and uploaded. The rest. Anyway, I'm going to call it there, because some people might be going to the session, the afternoon session that I think starts, if I remember rightly, at 2:30. So there's a bit of a break anyway. I won't. That's just me shooting from the hip. I don't have the program in front of me, so I refer to your program. Don't take it from me. But time to get some food here in the UK anyway. It's 1:14 here, so I'm going to thank you all. Thank Heidi and Beatrice and Sophie. Really great discussions, and look forward to joining you in others later. Thanks all.
Ciao.
Bye.
Thank
Ciao.
you. Bye bye. Thank you.